the 17th day of Tammuz. And first of all, we know that in the course of the year, there are 4 fast days that are connected with various aspects of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So I'm excluding Yom Kippur, which is in the Torah, and I'm excluding Tainus Esther, which is connected to Purim. But there are 4 other fast days that we have. The 10th of Teves, the 17th of Tammuz, the 9th of Av, and the fast of Gedalia, which is the day after Rosh Hashanah. And all 4 of them are connected in various ways with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Tisha B'Av is very, very obvious. Both the first Beis HaMikdash by the Babylonians and the second Beis HaMikdash by the Romans. The actual date of destruction was the 9th of Av in both cases, separated by 490 years. Where do I get 490? Because between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple is 70 years. Those are the 70 years of what are called the Babylonian exile. And Chazal have a tradition that the second temple stood for 420 years until it was destroyed by the Romans. So 70 plus 420 is 490 years. So the 9th of Av is obviously connected with the destruction of the temple. The 10th of Teves refers to when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, began a siege against Jerusalem, which culminated 3 years later in the destruction of the temple. The fast of Gedalia is actually after the destruction of the first temple, but it's kind of the nail in the coffin, because after Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first Beis HaMikdash, he appointed Gedalia, a very righteous Jew, to be governor of the small remnant of Jews that remained in Israel. And Gedalia was assassinated by a fellow Jew just a few months later, because keep in mind, if the temple was destroyed the 9th of Av, Gedalia, according to our tradition, was killed on Rosh Hashanah. So from the 9th of Av to Rosh Hashanah is less than 2 months. And in reality, the reason why we fast the day after Rosh Hashanah is simply because you're not allowed to fast on a holiday. Technically, Gedalia got killed on Rosh Hashanah. We fast the first available day, which is the 3rd of Tishrei, because Rosh Hashanah is a two-day holiday. Okay, so I want to talk about the 17th of Tammuz. And here, what's very, very illuminating is the Mishnah in Maseches Tainus gives us 2 listings of 5 events each. It says 5 tragic events happened on the 17th of Tammuz, and 5 tragic events happened on the 9th of Av. And that's why these are fast days. So let me start with the 9th of Av first, because the list is actually much more clear. On the 9th of Av is when it was decreed in the desert that our forefathers would wander for 40 years and die. That's connected to the sin of the Meraglim. The Meraglim came back after 40 days of journeying. They came back on the 8th of Av. They gave their negative report to the people on the 8th of Av. That night, the Chumash says, everybody cried and moaned and basically lost faith in Hashem. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, because you have made this night, the night of the 9th of Av, a crying for no reason, this shall become the day of real weeping and crying. So, tragedy number 1 of the 9th of Av, okay, not Shavuos, 9th of Av, is the Chet HaMeraglim and the Gezerah that we would wander in the desert for 40 years. Tragedy number 2 is the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash at the hands of the Babylonians, 9th of Av. Tragedy number 3 is 490 years later, the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash by the hands of the Romans. And the typical date that's given for that is the year 70 of the Common Era. Technically, I think Chazal look at it as 68, but between 68 and 70. So that's what? 3 tragedies. Tragedy number 4 on the 9th of Av goes to the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now again, just a little history. I don't want to overwhelm you with dates. As I said, the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. 60 years later, 130, there was a second revolt by the Jewish people against the Romans, and this was led by a man whose name was Shimon ben Kuziva, and Rabbi Akiva nicknamed him Bar Kokhba. That's a nickname. Bar Kokhba means the son of a star, because Mashiach is described as a star, and Rabbi Akiva actually believed that Bar Kokhba was a Mashiach. And a massive revolt started against the Roman rule of Eretz Yisrael under the spiritual leadership of Rabbi Akiva and under the military and political leadership of Bar Kokhba. This is called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. The Bar Kokhba Revolt was initially very, very successful. 900 towns were liberated from Roman rule by Bar Kokhba. Coins were minted. You can actually get them. They're not that expensive. You can get Bar Kokhba coins that were minted at the time. It says Shimon ben Kuziva, Nisi Yisrael. But eventually, the Romans, and the emperor at the time was Hadrian, retaliated with absolutely overwhelming force. And the last stand, the Bar Kokhba last stand, was in Beitar, which is not the modern Beitar, but not far from the modern Beitar. And the fall of Beitar, which was the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, according to Chazal, occurred on the 9th of Av as well. In other words, 65 years after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, superficially, your reaction might be, well, we lost the Beis HaMikdash. What could be worse than that? Why are you kind of adding on the aftermath of Beitar? That seems almost an anticlimactic tragedy. That's not at all the case. The tragedy of Beitar may have even been greater than the Churban Beis HaMikdash itself. The casualties that are recorded are significantly greater. I mean, the Gemara gives numbers in the millions, and even if commentaries say the numbers might be exaggerated, but it was massive, massive. More than that, all the things we read about in the Gemara about the Romans would torture people for learning Torah and doing mitzvos. That was not after. See, when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, as strange as it sounds, the Romans allowed the Jews who remained in Israel to keep the Torah. Yeah, they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, but you could put on tefillin, you could daven, you could learn Torah, you can do a bris milah. The Romans really didn't care what you were doing in your home or in your shul. They destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. So all of the anti-Torah laws that the Romans passed were not in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. They were in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt. So spiritually, the Bar Kokhba revolt was absolutely devastating. And according to tradition, that happened on the 9th of Av as well, in the secular year 135 of the Common Era. So we mentioned the sin of the spies, the first temple, the second temple, the Beitar revolt. And by the way, the Romans did not allow the bodies to be buried, hundreds of thousands of corpses, for 3 years. Miraculously, the corpses did not decompose. That was a supernatural miracle. And eventually they were buried 3 years later. And that's when the sages added the fourth blessing in benching, that God is good, hatov v'hametiv. God is good, God does good. God is good that the bodies didn't spoil, and he does good that we were permitted to bury them. That was added in the aftermath of the Beitar massacre. Okay, the fifth tragedy, and this is also after Beitar, is Hadrian ordered that Jerusalem be plowed with salt to destroy the natural fertility of the land. And that also was on Tisha B'Av, whether it was the same Tisha B'Av as the fall of Beitar or a year later, and we don't know the exact year, but this is an event. So the 5 events of the 9th of Av are fairly clear. I mean, we can trace the sequence from the Meraglim to the Churban Bayis Rishon, to the Churban Bayis Sheni, to the fall of Beitar, to the plowing of the city and the surrounding areas around the city. Now, in later times of history, there are other tragedies associated with the 9th of Av. For example, although this is a little questionable historically, but many say the final expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 may have been on the 9th of Av. And the start of World War I, which was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, one of the Habsburg, happened on the 9th of Av. And although that's World War I, but it is said World War I, World War II are really one continuous conflict. So you could say, in retrospect, the beginning of the Holocaust was on the 9th of Av through the process of World War I. Because remember, I don't want to go over history shiurim here, but a lot of Hitler's rise to power was because of the humiliations that Germany suffered in its defeat in World War I. I mean, that was Hitler's big campaign thing, that he was going to redress the humiliation that Germany had suffered. So in a sense, you wouldn't know it at the time, but in a sense, World War I, the start of World War I, was the catalyst that gave Hitler his power and therefore engineered the Holocaust. So in a sense, the Holocaust itself is connected indirectly with the 9th of Av. Okay, so 9th of Av, as I say, at least in terms of the listing of the Mishnah, the tragedies are fairly clear. But now let's go back and deal with the 17th of Tammuz. The 17th of Tammuz, almost each element, 5 tragedies, is a little bit obscure in terms of when did it happen and how do you figure it out. Except for the first one. The very first one is clear, although it also has a little bit of a problem. That is, the 17th of Tammuz was the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down 40 days from Shavuos, and Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchais because he saw the Jewish people worshiping the Chet HaEgel. So tragedy number 1 is B'Shiva Asar B'Tammuz Nishtabru Haluchais. So you can see that both Tisha B'Av and the 17th of Tammuz are rooted in very serious averos that are in the Torah itself. Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is rooted in the breaking of the luchais, and Tisha B'Av is rooted in the chet of the meraglim. So that's fairly clear. Now let's go on with the list. Second tragedy of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz was Hufka'a Ha'ir, the city, which means Jerusalem, the city Yerushalayim, was broken through. Meaning, both the Romans and the Babylonians, 500 years apart, before they destroyed the temple, they made a siege around Jerusalem. They cut off supplies, etc. And for 3 years, they could not break through the wall. But on the 17th of Tammuz, after 3 years of siege, they broke through the wall of Yerushalayim, and that's only 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, meaning to say there were 3 weeks between breaking into the city and destroying the temple. Hufka Ha'ir. Now here, although the Mishnah claims very, very explicitly that the city was breached on the 17th of Tammuz, the Gemara asks Akasha that in the book of Yirmiyahu, which is describing the Babylonians and the first temple, it says beferish that the Babylonians breached the wall on the 9th of Tammuz. So the Gemara asks Akasha, how can you say they breached the wall on the 17th of Tammuz? The pasuk in Yirmiyahu says they breached the walls of Jerusalem on the 9th of Tammuz. So the Bavli, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, gives the following answer. There happens to be a difference between the first temple and the second temple. Sefer Yirmiyahu is recording the Babylonians in the time of the first temple, and they breached the wall on the 9th of Tammuz, and it took a month until they destroyed the Mikdash on the 9th of Av. Masha'en Kain, the Mishnah, that says the walls of Yerushalayim were breached on the 17th, that's referring to the second temple. So then the question becomes, okay, so why do we fast on the 17th because of the second temple? Let's fast on the 9th of Tammuz because of the first temple. So the Gemara answers that when you have a succession of tragedies, you always emphasize the later tragedy because that's the one that's closest to you. So we go with the 17th. Why don't we have 2 fast days? Because to have a fast on the 9th of Tammuz and a fast on the 17th, that would have been too close. The Chachamim didn't want to make fast days so close to each other. Of course, there's a question on that, because consider Tzom Gedalia and Yom Kippur, right? We have 2 fast days that are pretty close to each other. We fast the day after Rosh Hashanah, and we fast a week later on Yom Kippur. So 9th and 17th is actually more than a week. It's more than 2 weeks. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's only 8 days. From the 9th to the 17th is 8 days, but it's, it's 1 day longer than Tzom Gedalia and Yom Kippur. Okay, that's a kasha. Now, so according to the Babylonian Talmud, the Babylonians breached Yerushalayim's wall on the 9th of Tammuz, and the Romans breached the wall on the 17th of Tammuz, and the fast day is based on the Churban Bayis Sheni. That's the Bavli. The Talmud Yerushalmi says something very, very fascinating. The Talmud Yerushalmi asks the same kasha on the Mishnah. How can you make a fast on the 17th? Because the wall was breached. According to the Navi Yirmiyahu, the wall was breached on the 9th of Tammuz. Same question. But instead of differentiating between the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash, the Talmud Yerushalmi actually says even the first Beis HaMikdash, the wall was breached on the 17th. But in the agitation and pain of the Churban Beis HaMikdash, people, even Nevi'im, got discombobulated, and they forgot the date, meaning when the temple gets destroyed on the 9th of Av, they couldn't even remember exactly when the enemy entered the city. And they mistakenly thought it was a month earlier. Kilkul cheshbonos. Kilkul. There was a mess up, a confusion of calculations. Just shows you how devastating the Churban Beis HaMikdash was. Okay, so that's the second tragedy of the 17th of Tammuz. The first is the breaking of the Luchais. The second is, that is when the enemy broke into the city, and there we have a machlokas, the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, how that worked vis-a-vis the first temple. But then we come to number 3. Number 3 says the Korban Tamid became canceled. They stopped bringing the Korban Tamid. What's the Korban Tamid? Tamid means constant, always. Every single day, every day of the year, Shabbos, Yom Kippur, every day of the year. Part of the avoda in the Beis HaMikdash is that a lamb was brought as a burnt offering in the morning, and a lamb was brought as a burnt offering in the late afternoon, and this is called the Korban Tamid. They are like bookends. The Korban Tamid of the morning is the first sacrifice offered in the day, and the Korban Tamid of the afternoon is the last sacrifice offered in the day. And in the middle, people would bring their sin offerings or whatever it would be in the middle. But these are the bookends. Tamid, always. So it says, on the 17th of Tammuz, the Tamid was discontinued. What is that exactly referring to? What do we mean the Tamid was discontinued? So I'm going to give you 3 different explanations, which are not in the Gemara. You have to kind of infer them from a variety of sources. The simple standard explanation that most people give when they learn the Mishnah is that the 17th of Tammuz refers to the same day that they broke through the wall, meaning the concept is, for the second temple, the Romans broke through the wall on the 17th of Tammuz. 3 weeks later, they destroyed the temple. But the point that's being made is, once the Romans broke through the wall and took control of the city, even though they didn't burn the temple till 3 weeks later, it no longer became possible to bring the Korban Tamid on a daily basis. Now, whether that means that the last 3 weeks there was no Korban Tamid at all, or maybe it just means it wasn't every day. That's another machlokas. When you say the tamid was batel, do you mean it wasn't brought at all, or do you just mean it wasn't tamid anymore? So the point I'm making is, according to pshat number one, which I think is the standard pshat that almost everybody will assume when they learn the Mishnah, the batel hatamid and the hufka ha'ir occurred at the same time, meaning it's referring to the last 3 weeks before the Churban Beis HaMikdash, that once the Romans entered the city, the Korban Tamid could no longer be brought on a regular basis. That's pshat number one. But if you look in Rashi, in the book of Daniel, which gives all sorts of messianic prophecies, Rashi says in the book of Daniel a very big chiddush. Rashi says, in the time of the Romans, that the Korban HaTamid ceased 3 years before the Korban, not when the Romans broke into the city, but when the Romans began their siege against the city. And in other words, and this actually makes a lot of sense, because what is a siege? A siege very specifically means you're blocking supplies from entering. So Rashi understands that on the 17th of Tammuz, shortly after the Romans began their siege, animals could no longer come in, and maybe there were some animals around, but according to Rashi, the last 3 years there was no Korban Tamid, or at least it was not every day. Same Shaila. Which means, according to Rashi, tragedy of Hufka Ha'ir and the tragedy of Batel HaTamid are not referring to the same time frame. Hufka Ha'ir was 3 weeks before the Chorban. Batel HaTamid is 3 years before the Chorban. So according to the conventional explanation, it was the Romans gaining control of the city that resulted in the Batel HaTamid. According to Rashi, it was the Roman siege of Yerushalayim that resulted in Batel HaTamid. Okay? A lot of people are not aware. Well, unfortunately, people don't learn Nach a lot. Especially a book like Daniel is, even within Nach, the book of Daniel is an unexplored corner, but it's in there. Rashi says the Korban Tamid stopped being brought 3 years before the Korban on the 17th of Tammuz. Okay. There actually is a third explanation, which moves Batel HaTamid to a much earlier point, not even connected with the Romans. And this goes back to the Hanukkah story. If you remember, Antiochus was overthrown by the revolt of the Maccabees, the Maccabim, and this is when there was a second temple. They purified the temple, they dedicated it, the miracle of Hanukkah, and the Chashmonaim, which was the family of Kohanim who led this revolt, the Chashmonaim established a monarchy called the Hasmonean monarchy, which ruled for over 100 years until the Romans came in. And if you remember from a prior life, George Orwell's book, not 1984, but the other book, Animal Farm, which is a parody of the Russian Revolution, and remember the animals revolt against the oppressing human masters, and some of the animals become dictators themselves, and that was his take on the Russian Revolution. And that's a tragedy in which you become the very enemy that you were trying to defeat. In a way, this tragedy happened to the Hasmonean kings, because the whole revolt of the Maccabees was against Hellenism, against Greek culture, which tried to replace the Torah. And they fought this revolt to reestablish Torah as the guiding light of the Jewish people. But the tragedy was that the later Hasmonean kings actually became Hellenists. They became Hellenists. They became the very enemy that their ancestors had been fighting. So towards the end of the Hasmonean period, remember the temple is up here. This is not, the Romans aren't in yet. There actually was a civil war between two Jewish brothers who were claimants to the Hasmonean throne, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. First of all, these names are obviously Greek names. So you see already that their names were Greek. And one brother had control of the city, and the other brother, Jew against Jew, was besieging the city to gain control and establish himself as Malchus. I always forget which one. One was inside, one was outside. I don't remember. Hyrcanus inside, Aristobulus outside, or vice versa. But two brothers with their armies. The brother, now, so the Gemara mentions the following story. Even though this was a civil war of Jew against Jew, even the outside brother wanted the temple service to continue. So even though they were blocking supplies, every day, it says, the people on the inside would lower a basket with coins to buy an animal, and the people on the outside would put a lamb in the basket and lift it up. So when you had the Hasmonean civil wars, even the enemy group on the outside would supply animals for the Korban Tamid. Right? The basket was lowered with the money, and then the basket was filled with lambs. Came in. There was a guy at some point on the outside who said, this is a self-defeating proposition. You're fighting this enemy in Jerusalem, and you're letting them bring the Korban Tamid. Maybe that's why God is protecting them. So he said, stop doing it. So it mentions a story, a very horrendous story, that is repeated in the Gemara 3 times. So apparently Chazal wanted you to be aware of this story, that when the people on the inside lowered the basket to get there with the money, to get the Korban Tamid, the people on the outside, remember Jews, not Romans, Jews, instead of putting in a lamb, they put in a pig. And as the basket was being raised, because the people on the inside didn't know this, it says the pig started squealing out loud, and it stuck its hooves into the stone wall. And it mentions the cry of the pig, this is an allegorical expression, created an earthquake in Eretz Yisrael, meaning it was such an outrageous thing. And according to this story happened on the 17th of Tammuz. So when it says Batal HaTamid, it doesn't necessarily mean a permanent cessation, because we don't know what happened the next day. Maybe things got better the next day or whatever. But it's referring to that one-time story. And it's almost a euphemism. Instead of saying, it was the day that a pig was put in the basket, it doesn't want to say that. It just says, it was the day that the Korban Tamid was not offered. So according to this pshat, Batal HaTamid is not connected to the Romans. It's not connected to the destruction of the temple. It doesn't mean a permanent cessation. It refers to this one-time event that was a tremendous chilul Hashem, a desecration of God's name and the holiness of the temple. But it happened the 17th of Tammuz. So that's a third explanation. By the way, let me go on with this, that as this civil war continued, and neither side was gaining, one side had the city, and the other side was unsuccessfully trying to penetrate. Not the Romans, these are Jew against Jew. So the guy on the outside, I always forget if it's Hyrcanus or Aristobulus, tried to get some outside help. And they asked the Romans to send some mercenaries to help them out. And the general they contacted was a very, very famous Roman general. He was Julius Caesar's good buddy. His name was Pompey. Now that's the same name as the city that got destroyed with the volcano, but different spelling anyway. And Pompey was invited to enter Eretz Yisrael in order to wage war on behalf of the Hasmonean sect that is outside of the city. But you invite the Romans into your land. Once Pompey got into country, Pompey figured, why do I have to fight for Jew against Jew? I'll just take over the whole thing. Which means the Roman conquest of Eretz Israel came by invitation. This was the year 63 before the Common Era. So how many years? In other words, the Romans took over 63 BCE. The temple was destroyed 70 CE. So how many years was there Roman rule until there was destruction of the temple? 133 years. Right, you got the cheshbon. In other words, contrary to what people sometimes think, oh, the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, they ruled 133 years before they destroyed the temple. Okay. Everyone knows the famous teaching of Chazal, that the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of the worst Averos, of Avodah Zarah, idolatry, Gilui Arayos, sexual immorality, and murder. But the second Beis HaMikdash, many Jews were keeping the mitzvot. So why was there a destruction of the temple? Because of the sin of sinas chinam. Now, we certainly understand that in a general Musar sense, polarization, machlokes, hatred. But I want to point out how historically you can actually pinpoint this, because here is the thing. What brought the Romans into Eretz Israel, giving them a foothold, eventually culminating in the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash? The hatred between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. It's a direct line. The sinas chinam of brother against brother brought the Romans in. And once the Romans were in, and they oppressed us and ruled over us, at some point they were given the power to destroy the temple. So it's not just the generic idea that Jews weren't getting along with each other, although that's very true. There's a specific historical context to this. Okay. Now, so you see that this is a more complicated, these tragedies, so to speak, are a little more complicated. So we talked about 3 tragedies so far. We talked about the breaking of the luchos. We talked about the city being breached. We talked about the cessation of the carbon tamid and the different meanings of that. 4th tragedy, it says, a man called Apustamus, otherwise unknown, burnt a Torah scroll. Saraf Apustamus es HaTorah. So there's a lot of problems here. Number 1, who is Apustamus? Maybe it doesn't matter, but who is he? Number 2, when did this happen? There's no time reference at all to when it happened. And a 3rd problem, which may sound callous, is burning a Torah scroll is an awful, awful thing. If God forbid you see a Torah scroll burning, you have to rip your garments. But Lamaisa, it's not so unique. I mean, how many Torah scrolls did the Nazis burn? Meaning, are you going to make a fast day for eternity until Mashiach comes because a Torah scroll was burnt? Yeah, I can understand that the day you see a Torah scroll being burnt, you should actually fast. That's true. But you don't have to fast every year on the anniversary of it. So why would this burning of a Torah scroll be so powerful and devastating that that would be a reason for the fasting? So some people learned that this was not a regular Torah scroll. This was a very, very special Torah scroll. On the day that Moshe Rabbeinu died, Moshe Rabbeinu miraculously wrote 13 Torah scrolls, Sifrei Torah. Of the first 12, he gave 1 Torah to each tribe, and the 13th Torah was put in the Kodesh HaKodashim with the Aron. Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah scroll in the Aron HaKodesh did not exist, or was not available by the time of the Second Temple because the Aron was concealed. Remember, the Bayis Sheni didn't have an Aron HaKodesh. It was concealed. We don't know where it is. So that Sefer Torah scroll was not accessible. What happened to the ones that were given to the tribes? I don't know. That seems to be gone. But the one Torah that they had a Sefer Torah that was written by Ezra, who was the leader of the return to Eretz Israel at the beginning of the Second Temple. Ezra, in many ways, is compared by Chazal to be a second Moshe Rabbeinu. Chazal even say that Ezra was worthy of receiving the Torah had it not already been given through Moshe Rabbeinu. And we had the Torah of Ezra. So when it says Apustimus burnt the Torah, this is the time of the Second Temple, he burnt the Torah, i.e., the special Torah scroll of Ezra. And that was a very devastating thing because since Ezra was like the second Moshe, the Torah scroll of Ezra connected us to Moshe Rabbeinu in that sense. And Apustimus, according to this, was simply a Roman official who participated in the destruction of the temple, and his activity was he burnt a Torah scroll. He probably got a medal for it, for whatever it would be. That was his contribution to the Roman devastation of Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael. Now, the final tragedy is also obscure. It says, on the 17th of Tammuz, an idolatrous image was put up in the temple. That's an awful thing. Now, here, too, we have a little bit of a problem, because if you're locating it in terms of the Roman devastation, there is no recorded event of the Romans actually putting up an idol in the temple. There's a record of an attempt to do so. One of the Roman emperors before the Churban was Caligula. You might have heard of Caligula. Caligula was brutal to everybody, not just the Jews. He was brutal to everybody. He was non-discriminatory in his brutalities. Caligula was also crazy. He was certifiably insane. It's recorded in Roman history that he made his horse his viceroy. He made his horse his assistant emperor and the like. And it is recorded that Caligula decreed, he ordered that statues of himself be placed in all temples, including the Jewish temple, that he be worshipped as a god. So it is recorded that he gave that order, but Josephus tells us that the Jewish people, at great risk to their lives, refused to listen to that order. And they were prepared to fight the Roman armies. So Caligula's statue never got put up. Somebody convinced Caligula that it's not Kedai to make a fight right now. Somehow he was convinced to withdraw his decree. So if that's the case, we're left with the problem. What is the Mishnah referring to when the Mishnah says on the 17th of Tammuz an idol was erected in the temple? We know that Caligula attempted to do that, but Caligula was not successful. So because of this, the commentaries say that the idol is not referring to anything that happened under the Romans. You got to move it again much earlier. We know Antiochus, during the Hanukkah story, Antiochus had control of the temple for 3 years. And during those 3 years, he made houses of prostitution, pigs were sacrificed on the altar, and idols were placed in the temple. So the Humad Selam Behechel is not going on the Romans, it's going all the way back to Antiochus. And Chazal had a tradition, I don't know how we have proof for the date, that it was the 17th of Tammuz that Antiochus erected a statue. And some even make it much, much earlier, to the first temple. In the book of Kings, in Sefer Malachim, you have one of the evil kings was Menashe. And so it's a Jew. Menashe put idols in the temple. So the point I'm making is that unlike the 5 tragedies of the 5 of Av, which are more or less in chronological order, right? Chet HaMeraglim, Chorban Bayis Rishon, Chorban Bayis Sheni, destruction of Beitar, plowing the city. That's a straight chronological sequence. when we come to the 5 tragedies of the 17th of Tammuz, you kind of zigzag. They happen at different times. Some happened in Antiochus' time, some happened in biblical times, etc. Some happened in Hyrcanus and Aristobulus times, some happened in Roman times. So it's an important lesson that sometimes to understand even Mishnayos, you need to have a historical background of when and where these different events occurred. The one thing we do have to remember is that the Navi Zechariah, who talks about these fast days, promises us that when Mashiach comes, not only will these days not be fast days, but they will be days of rejoicing, days of simcha, days of redemption. It is still very possible that we will not have to fast this Sunday. But the joy of not fasting is not because we're not fasting. The joy is the reason why we wouldn't be fasting. Yeah.
So does that imply also that Tisha B'Av would be like the most joyous day?
Absolutely. Tisha B'Av, specifically Tisha B'Av, but all the other ones as well. So the joy would be not that I can eat. The joy would be why I could eat, and that would be the bringing of the redemption. So B'Yesras Hashem, I hope that we will not have to fast this year at all, not only not to fast the 9th of Av, but not even to fast the 17th of Tammuz. But if Chas v'Shalom we are not deserving and we do have to fast, may it be a meaningful fast, a fast of reflection, a fast of tshuva, a fast in which we do whatever we can to try to bring the Geula Shlema for Am Yisrael. So have a good Shabbos.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.